Well, we might get things off to a start. Thank you everyone for coming. This is my first PILnet, so I'm really excited to be here. My name is Toby Collis. I'm the Learning and Development Manager at A4IB, Advocates International Development. Most of you know us, some of you don't, so I'll just give a brief explanation of what we do. We work with lawyers to work with the eradication of poverty. We were an organisation that was founded by law firms. We want to work towards working international development for the eradication of poverty. We do that in a few ways. We are a global clearinghouse, but also we do a number of activities of training and capacity building for lawyers and for international development organisations. Our interest in Africa and East Africa started a couple of years ago. We have a number of our legal partners, so firms that work with us to take pro bono projects that are African firms. Also, many of our global firms have offices in Africa as well. About 3 or 4 years ago, we worked with the Clifford Chance Foundation to deliver a series of trainings on business and human rights for lawyers. And the way we do this is a peer-to-peer learning initiative where we get lawyers from our legal partners to travel to East Africa to do these trainings. And we've done these in most jurisdictions in East Africa. And the other thing we really want to work on is developing legal pro bono in East Africa. I think it's fairly axiomatic to say a model of firms in the global north providing legal support in the global south is useful and important, but obviously must be supplemented by local lawyers doing work on local issues. That's something we really care about. The issue of pro bono in Africa was sort of brought up last year. I wasn't involved in those conversations, but it began with informal conversations, and really it was started by a provocative question of why do we not have as many African colleagues at PILnet as we would like, and so what should we do about that? And as a result of that, there was some informal roundtables that have been going on over the last year. What can we do, and how can we move this forward? And it moved on to various working groups on working regionally and how we can sort of develop various pro bono activities. But really, there's a lot for us to learn more than what we can do. And so this session, I want to talk about what it's not. And it's not to sort of dictate the terms of what pro bono should be in Africa. It's not to dictate how global law firms should be working there and what we can offer. It's really for us to be listening, for us to hear stories, for us to hear successes, to generate ideas and to create partnerships. We have a lot to learn. For example, I think there's some fantastic initiatives going on in Africa with respect to pro bono. One that really excites me is what happens in Uganda. In Uganda, they use a play or pay model of pro bono. Either you do pro bono your firm, or you pay a contribution to the Law Society. My understanding is it has been a victim of its own success. The Law Society has a lot of money as a result of the pro bono fund. And so we have to sort of maybe tinker with the model, but there's some really exciting things going on, so we have a lot to learn. And that's the purpose of this panel, is for us learning, for us talking. This is meant to be a collaborative panel. I really want engagement both from all our panels. We'll be having an open discussion. I really want engagement from the audience. We would love to have questions. We want to have sort of interrogations of the positions. We want to generate ideas, and we want to have some exciting partnerships come out of this. And so I hope we can all be part of that. So I just want to introduce the fantastic speakers we have for this session. Going along from my left is Marlene Hoffman. She's with the Center for Reproductive Rights in the US. We have Michelle Odeyan, who's part of probono.org. Jonathan Kaufman of Advocates for Community Alternatives, and Stanley Nyamahindi of the SADC Lawyers Association. And the way we're just going to start this is just to give each of our panelists just a brief time to talk about the work they do, and particularly their work with respect to pro bono in Africa. So, Marlene?
Sure. So hi, it's great to be here. Actually, I wish the head of my African program was here, but I'll try to channel her and her knowledge. So the Center for Reproductive Rights is a global NGO that really tries to have governments abide and enforce human rights laws that respect women and girls' reproductive health. And that's from child marriage to maternal care to access to safe and legal abortion. In Africa, our office is in Nairobi. It's actually small, it's about 14, 15 people. It's actually our largest office outside of the States. And they have been there for a number of years. What has been really interesting for me as a director pro bono is to learn that each of our regions emphasize their work a little differently, which is probably not surprising, knowing that every culture is different. And how pro bono works in each region, whether it be Latin America or Africa or Asia, is different. So in Africa, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today, that we're having this panel, we have a new focus on, first I should backtrack and say we work with a large number of international firms and global firms, which are fabulous and wonderful in the work that they assist us with. But that in Africa, we have had a new focus in trying to develop more regional resources, more regional pro bono resources that really address the issues in East Africa, where we work mainly, and Nigeria, where we also work. So that means two things. It means working with global law firms that have affiliated firms or offices in Africa, and also trying to develop more resources in country of firms that originate from Africa. And those are different strategies as we try and look at that. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more. Having the most experience with global law firms, that is probably the first tier we go to, and whether it be DLA or Dentons, and say, can we have access to and work with your firms in various countries, and usually on comparative research or litigation support. A little more, there are less firms in Africa that have that kind of wide net. And what we have been able to do is develop a relationship with a firm in Kenya. That's known as Andrew Waller. And Andrew Waller and others have worked, and we can talk about it more, as part of the East, I think it's an African Legal Network, which means they have sister and brother offices in other countries. And what happens with an NGO like ours, because some of our issues might be deemed a little political, big surprise, or controversial, with a firm that's in Africa, like Untitled, we started working with them on really transactional legal issues to support our office there. And they got to know us much, much better. And growing from that, we now work with them on substantive legal work. They recently did a short comparative law study for us on assisted reproductive technology in Kenya. So it's a growing relationship and maturing one. The next level, which I think is probably the one that's the most challenging, and I would love to hear from people how they do this, is trying to work with smaller African law firms that are in country. And I think that's when it becomes into a discussion of what is the definition of pro bono, how is pro bono viewed, because, you know, many times we from, I'll say me from the West, come into another region with the idea of how we define pro bono. And that's not true in Africa throughout. So how do you figure that out, and how do you work, and how do you develop those relationships that are going to support your work in Africa with understanding the local culture, but also trying to evolve in more, let's say, sophisticated pro bono environment. So that's, you know, where Michael's at.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Michelle, and I joined Pro Bono sort of 8 months ago. It's my first time here at PILnet, and delighted to be here. The context for Pro Bono in South Africa, one with a country that has approximately 56 million people, of which maybe more than half live in poverty, and the inequality levels are pretty stark. Huge unemployment, a young set of people, almost 26% in the country unemployed, and are within the band of 17 to about 29. I say this because South Africa is a unique creature. From our political context, the transition, and the spectacular constitution that we have, make us somewhat interesting to study, interesting for some of the developments and some of the legal transformation stuff that's been happening in the past years. But I think it's also really important to stress that there is no one-size-fits-all in South Africa, albeit we live and work in the same country. Pro Bono started 12 years ago. The context perhaps was slightly different then, but now, 12 years later, we find that the civil legal needs of hundreds of thousands of people have increased. And the kind of capacity that Pro Bono has in rendering a clearinghouse function has been limited based on the demand for services and the supply of a ready and steady set of legal practitioners offering their services to our clients. We deal primarily with civil legal needs, and I suppose in the global context we're slightly different in that a large offering of our services extends to individuals and communities and then not-for-profit organizations. We work through a means test which varies from one province to the other, and we've tried to find some harmonization around the means test, which is a monetary, almost, money poor kind of determinant. My thinking is that Pro Bono in the global context and in the South African context seems to have similar challenges. And the one particular challenge is the utility of legal practitioners who convey their interest to do pro bono. And I heard yesterday that even though you would have a steady interest from the structured profession, their utility value in actually delivering a legal service on behalf of a client is pretty low. Based on some of the challenges we've encountered in that sort of area, we've also had a very active strategy in legal empowerment. And this would extend to both communities, but, and I don't know if this would be a statement of contradiction, but with attorneys as well, in understanding different aspects of the law as it relates to the civil legal needs of people. So we've had a big focus on attorney or legal practitioner development as much as legal empowerment to expand access to justice and rights awareness generally. Long story short, legal needs in South Africa seem to be high in demand, capacity is little, and we have an over-reliance on some of the bigger law firms. And in South Africa we talk about a big five, some of whom are international, that have a global footprint, and Johannesburg, being the commercial hub in South Africa, we tend to rely a lot more on them. We're trying to expand, as you mentioned, Manu, to include and have more local, indigenous, South African-owned law firms to join us as partners, both in their investment in pro bono as a contribution, but also in some of the financial investments that are needed to keep pro bono sustainable. Because we're wholly dependent on donors, and South Africa is viewed as a middle-income country, although that too is subject to contestation. And with the steady outflow of donor resources, it makes it much more important for us to have a more shared value strategy, so that our partners, our law firms and advocates and attorneys and the legal sector as a whole invested in us as an intermediary to be able to assemble the need that allows the legal sector to meet its professional and moral obligations.
Fascinating. So it sounds like South Africa is it's on its way. It's relatively sophisticated in the pro bono services, but there are certainly challenges and lots of opportunities. Moving to Ghana, with advocates for community alternatives, so what's going on? Where's the pro bono space?
Thanks, Toby. My name's Jonathan. I run an organization called Advocates for Community Alternatives. We're based in Accra, Ghana, but we work actually across the West African region. So while in some ways it's absurd to speak for West Africa, if you've seen the map, then you know there's a lot of relatively small and some enormous but mostly empty countries. But with a multitude of legal systems and histories and cultures. But I can draw some generalizations. ACA, our mission is to harness law and community mobilization on behalf of rural and urban communities whose existence and lives and livelihoods and rights are threatened by a destructive, extractive model of development. And we work with them to both fight off threats, but also use law and community mobilization tools to envision what the future should be like and pursue that vision through development, implementation, through advocacy, and through community organization. I think most relevant to this gathering here is that we are also the coordinating body for a network of human rights and environmental lawyers across 9 countries in West Africa called the Public Interest Lawyering Initiative for West Africa, or PILnet. This initiative came about because some of the very few public interest lawyers, dedicated public interest lawyers in the region, felt that they recognized that they were getting a lot of attention and support from the international donor community, and they were doing the best they could to meet legal pro bono and public interest legal needs in their countries, but there just weren't enough people. The culture, the legal culture in, I don't know, any West African country, maybe Nigeria is something of an exception, but in general, the culture does not support the idea of working for the poor, working for the marginalized, using laws for social justice. That's not part of the history, not part of the culture. These are not cultures where lawyers were always part of the fights for social justice, which was the case in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. It certainly was the case in the United States, where I'm from. Instead, these are countries where lawyers are big men, and occasionally women, but too infrequently. The status of a lawyer is extremely high. Your bar card in Guinea will get you past any roadblock, and there are a lot of them. But law is not really seen as applying for the most part. Formal legal structures aren't seen as applying to the poor. Instead, traditional forms of dispute resolution and handling of issues are what the rural poor are expected to use, or they're expected to just accept what comes to them. So honestly, we have light years to go when it comes to pro bono in West Africa. The people that I work with, they're mostly NGO lawyers. The idea of a pro bono establishment almost doesn't exist. The idea that local law firms will set aside some of their time to work with communities, to work with people in need. It's very rare that you see this. And in fact, lawyers who decide that they do want to spend some of their time, commercial private lawyers who want to spend some of their time working with the marginalized, are often ridiculed as wasting their time and wasting their opportunities. I know one of the few people in Mali who works on this, met Amadou Diallo, and he is ridiculed in the press as the poor people's lawyer. That's not a badge of honor in Mali, although he wears it as an honor. So there's a lot that can be done. The bright side, I can say, is that in preparation for coming here, I did talk to a lot of people, friends in Ghanaian law firms, for example, including a South African-based law firm that has an arm in Ghana. I think, especially among young lawyers and law students, there is an excitement when you tell them that law can be more than this, but they're really confused as to how they can build into part of their education. There's no coordinating mechanism. There's no conception of the different roles that lawyers can play in communities, that it goes beyond litigation, it goes beyond the kind of thing that might create a business conflict for their firm, that there's a lot of things that you can do using law to empower and make people's lives better. So I think there's opportunity there, but it's very fragmented. It requires a culture change, a lot of education, and a lot of organization.
Thanks, John. It sounds like there's some really interesting sort of points that we're going to tease out. So we've gone from the kind of the NGO side thing, and we've sort of had what's going on with pro bono brokerage in South Africa, and moved to West Africa. So regionally, in Southern Africa, and with SADC, what's going on, Stanley? What is your organization doing?
Yes, thank you very much, Toby. You're quite right that the important thing is to get Africa onto this forum and to be able to participate more. And I don't think that there's any better way to do that than to get moving. So we've taken a step in the Southern African Development Community. And as SADC Lawyers Association, we have started what we call the Pro Bono Network. Now this is operating on 2 levels. We actually have what we have as the Pro Bono Lawyers Network, where we are organizing the 15 member SADC countries, their bar associations, law societies, and individual lawyers to organize themselves to contribute more effectively to pro bono. Now what my friend here said, Jonathan, is very, very important that the culture of pro bono is still very low in Africa. And lawyers who want to do pro bono are frowned upon, and they actually find themselves being marginalized by government and missing opportunities to make money in business simply because they are dedicating themselves to human rights causes. And this is a very, very important aspect, which means that as SADC Lawyers Association, as a regional body, we've got a very strong convening capacity and presence within corridors of power, and we can use this to convince and to mobilize support for our initiatives. Now, as lawyers, obviously, it's not important for us to walk alone. We're doing this for civil society. We're trying to connect to communities. So our work actually has to translate into results. And how are we going to do this? And we actually then convene what we call a Pro Bono Forum. It is really a micro global forum, but it is restricted to the Southern African region. And I'm glad to say, with the help of PILnet, GAF was there in Mozambique when we had our inaugural Pro Bono Forum. And NGOs and civic society in Southern Africa, corporates, and some other government functionaries and departments came. Law firms and bar associations, and created a distinct platform with a regional working committee where we're going to define our priorities for pro bono. Now, you know, in Southern Africa, the issue is around extractives, investment, whether it's good or bad, and how to make sure that our governments leverage the best deals for positive social development and economic impact. Now, I'm not going to do too much talking, but I just thought it's important to formally introduce SADC Lawyers Association, because this is the first time, courtesy of the invitation by PILnet, thank you, that we are participating in this forum. So you won't have to suffer this next year. So, like I said, we've got the 15 member SADC country bar associations, and we are dedicated to the advancement and promotion of the rule of law, democracy, good governance in the SADC region and beyond. Now, as Michelle said, 56 million people in South Africa, and only 25,000 lawyers for them. In countries like Lesotho, it's worse. We've got about 5 million people with 400 lawyers. So the possibility of increasing access to justice cannot be achieved if we do not do it across borders and come together as a critical mass of lawyers, coordinated to work with civic society, so that we remove those borders and allow everybody everywhere to access a lawyer, notwithstanding the borders that divide us. Now, more importantly, we're based in South Africa. I just put out a map there to show exactly where we are in the southern region. That is the southern part of Africa. And like I said, rule of law, we're ensuring that we're intervening in many capacities. We do fact-finding missions, we do electoral observations, we do training. And these, I think, are very strong instruments of public interest law that we're using as lawyers to get ahead. We do have our secretariat, we do have our council. Our annual general meeting is in Victoria Falls next year, and we'd like to invite all of you to come. It's a very beautiful place. And we'll get also a lot of work done, and you might be in a position to also attend the second Pro Bono Forum for the SADC region, which is very important. The strategic areas that we deal with are listed there. I'm not going to deal with them, but more importantly, why did we decide to do pro bono? I've just outlined the statistical deficit, but more importantly, we're working in a place where we've got repressive regimes. The lawyers need to develop new tools of fighting the battle for human rights and rule of law promotion. And it is no longer a reactive process, it has to be a proactive process. We need to engage, we need to organize, and we need to strategize. And public interest law networks are really the best next thing to unlock that potential for the future of our region. Obviously, as a regional bar association, we are able to mobilize the critical mass, and we are able to coordinate the existing efforts. I must emphasize that we're not trying to recreate anything. This is the will. We've been able to make friends who are showing us exactly how it is and simply how to put it in place so that our world will start moving. And you've got initiatives like Michelle's, which have been very effective, and we're saying we're working with them to complement, to reinforce, but more importantly, make the case for pro bono more effective and impactful. And like I said, we want to build that culture of pro bono, and we have to allow lawyers to give back, to reinvent that image, that lawyers are not only there to take, because it's also affecting our partnerships where development partners really believe that we're out there for the money. And I'm sure this is less than 1% of the lawyers who are taking this money, and the rest are really suffering and not in a position to actually maintain viable business models simply because they choose to be pro bono lawyers. Steps taken. This was basically the first meeting that we had of all bar associations, and you can see Garth there, yours truly. We had this meeting, and this is when we agreed that we are going to commit as bar associations to this cause. So we had the conception of a common cause. You can see right there one of the key instruments of our development, an agreement with the African Development Bank that we're going to train our lawyers in complex commercial transactions, how to negotiate with governments and to help their governments structure good deals, manage the issue of sovereign debt, because this is becoming a very, very strong topic in terms of how our governments are becoming captured or probably, in a way, almost colonized again through debt. This is a backdoor strategy, and we need to train our lawyers how to manage that and to help our governments manage that. So we had this training last month in Kigali, and we trained about 30 young lawyers. It's one step at a time, and we're growing. Now we're doing also some election observation there, and the important aspects about that is that we're using our expertise to advise regional missions on international election observation, governments and NGOs, giving them expert legal advice on the legal frameworks and their application, and to see and identify gaps. Now the idea is we need to make sure that our elections in Africa become meaningful and can actually translate to positive change, and this is really not the case right now. The slide is running, but I'll just let it. It's not the case right now, and we are very much concerned that on a pro bono basis, without getting paid, we are going out there and intervening in elections. So, like I said, we have had that meeting with bar associations, we have had the Pro Bono Forum itself, and we've invested in technical partnerships, and we are very grateful that God was able to pick us up on the radar. I'm not sure how he does it, but he picked us up and he came out, and we also have on board now organizations like probono.org, very much experienced. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're getting into it. And the next steps that we're actually working with is trying to now create the formal framework. We need a database, software, IT-based tools and solutions which make this very easy, effective, and economic as well, because we are trying to reduce the cost of accessing justice. And then we assessing the key needs of our individual law societies and jurisdictions. In South Africa, the pro bono system is a bit more well developed, so it's possible to transfer those best practices to the other jurisdictions, and this is how, as a regional bar association, we become more effective, clearing house functions and the technicalities, sending them to all our societies, capacity building of the legal profession itself, because they need training, they need skills, and then obviously we have to establish a presence, and there's going to be a whole lot of work to do in terms of advocacy and letting governments, letting civil society know that this space is now available. It's a safe space that we're creating, and we all need to be there to use it. And most importantly, we really want to make friends and partners, and you're all welcome to our initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. It's really exciting to hear these developments, but a common theme that I'm hearing is in that, and particularly that many commercial firms, maybe less so in South Africa, but certainly in other places, are not willing to do this program because there's an idea that this is not something that commercial lawyers do and private firms do. And one of the issues that I think we discussed as a group beforehand that often conflates the problem, and it sounds like it's a problem that has been discussed for years and years and years at PILnet conferences, the conflation between legal aid and pro bono, and that the commercial firms in Africa say, well, we don't do legal aid work, so that's why we're not doing pro bono. How can we, is this a problem, and how can we challenge it? How can we sort of harmonise ideas of what the definition of pro bono is, at least regionally, but maybe even further? So I'll open that up to the panel.
Thank you very much. I think one of the ways that we have responded to this challenge very significant is to try to come up with legal frameworks that regulate our law society in such a way that it becomes peremptory to do pro bono. You get CPD points so that you're able to register or to get a license for your next year. So also it has become an incentive therefore to do pro bono for our law firms.
I was going to say in Kenya, when I was lucky enough to visit there last April, what I experienced is that different entities like FIDA Kenya, which is basically a women's sort of bar association, that reaches out and tries to refer cases on a pro bono level for domestic violence and other issues, has grown in acceptance, that whole mechanism, and the Law Society of Kenya also. I think the ongoing problem I heard from folks was that there wasn't a large enough bar to give those services, but an understanding. And when we held a pro bono forum that DLA co-sponsored with us, with the Law Society of Kenya and FIDA, we had a number of individual private attorneys attend to actually work with the Law Society and FIDA and do matters on a pro bono basis. And if that's sort of the seedling of growing, I think, more in the country.
So in South Africa, we have a little more technical separation between pro bono and legal aid. So legal aid in South Africa is largely perceived as taking care of criminal legal needs of accused persons who cannot afford representation. They do have a small component where they would offer some civil legal support, and this could be in areas of employment law, equality issues, domestic violence, and a number of other subsets of civil legal needs. However, pro bono tends to attract a larger number of people seeking redress for civil legal needs. And so in South Africa, I think we have in our minds a little technical separation, that pro bono takes care of a load of the civil legal needs and legal aid is criminal. Albeit, you know, in an ecosystem of a number of other public interest, not-for-profit entities, who then take on some of the more complex socioeconomic rights issues, constitutional impact litigation, etc. So as pro bono, we don't get involved in any impact litigation. So we don't litigate in our own name. But the opportunity for law firms who may have a number of matters that relate to a particular aspect of civil legal need, they might, you know, very well want to take it on behalf of their clients. Because once a client moves from pro bono, they effectively become a client of the legal practitioner.
I would say that in West Africa there is that inflation, but in some ways it's almost an academic distinction, because the concept of pro bono and the practice of pro bono practically doesn't exist. I mean, in general, social justice lawyering for poor people and communities is the province of NGOs, and if there is a legal aid board, which there generally are in most countries, it's very, very strapped for cash. What is being done there is being driven largely by what foreign donations are available, to a certain extent the same way that NGO lawyering is happening. So, maybe there's a problem there. Maybe that when people think about should I work for people who need legal assistance, they think, oh, no, that's what legal aid does. But legal aid, I don't think it's really, I don't think that's the main issue, to be honest. Because really what you see is when poor communities have access to justice, it's largely a function of the nonprofit community and of the international development cooperation community.
So we're here at PILnet, we're sharing this event as us NGO folks with global firms. And what I want to explore is we briefly discussed this tension between a lot of the time we're working with the global firms in Africa, but really there is also a need to be working with local firms. So What are the roles of global firms in doing pro bono in Africa? Should there be more, or even should there be less? What do we all think about that?
So I have to say, because we work with a large group of global firms, I actually think they should do more. But so I'll come from that aspect. Our work's a little bit different because it's not access to justice work. It's really human rights, impact litigation, advocacy, work at the UN. So many global law firms that either have offices in Africa or who, so I was much more about East Africa. So if they're London-based and they have that wealth of common law jurisprudence, can add so much to our work in Africa. Everything from, even if we're litigating in Kenya, our attorney is Kenya admitted, and he's litigating and she's litigating in Kenya. But many times we need additional resources to support that litigation, whether it be strategic research about how you're going to formulate it, drafting of papers, working on amicus briefs, sometimes coming in as co-counsel on an amicus brief. We all work in Africa with local partners. We're always very sensitive and want to be aware. Does it make sense to have, number one, the center, and number two, a large non-African based law firm come in, and depending upon what those sensitivities are, we vary. But the law firms will bring in on a global level enormous resources to do our work. And to actually, I know someone mentioned expanding capacity, which has been another huge goal, in terms of expanding our capacity in Africa. We are, as I said, it's funny, we're the largest non-US office is 14 people, not a lot, but we've been working a lot with local attorneys in Africa who are interested in learning about sexual and reproductive health and putting together curriculums and meetings, and we've been invited in certain countries like Uganda and Kenya to present at judicial roundtables. To be able to do that, we really needed the help of a global law firm, and I can call out because Patrick's there, White and Case, to help us develop a judicial curriculum that will be used throughout Africa and hopefully Asia, and to make sure that we're able to increase that capacity on the ground of knowledge on sexual and reproductive health law and human rights guarantees under it. So they've been a great resource for us. So I say more, come on, more of you might get involved.
I would love to see global law firms getting more involved in pro bono provision in West Africa. I think it makes a lot of sense, because the global law firms understand that pro bono is not just about individual cases, it's about identifying the resources and the expertise that are needed for a particular situation and resourcing it, right? And the global law firms have their local partners in various national capitals. It's harder once you get out to the countryside, but they do. They have people to draw on. So if the people who need legal assistance need help with land issues, then maybe it's not going to be litigation, but a global law firm is going to know who to go to because they have to negotiate their own lease. And so I think there's a coordinating role that can be played by a global law firm in a part of the world like West Africa where firms are quite small. And my law firm friends in Ghana said it's not that no one would do pro bono, it's that our law firms can't spare people because we're small. And there's at least a conception that we can't spare people for pro bono projects, and we definitely don't have anyone to coordinate these cases. On the other hand, I'm conscious of one of the things that Stanley mentioned, which is that in a lot of cases, the private lawyers who are most likely to want to get involved in pro bono are people who are excluded from these international networks and aren't the ones who are getting the big contracts from the government, and therefore probably aren't the ones who have the relationships with White Case. And so there's this pool, potentially there's a pool of people who might be morally attracted to pro bono, but also might see doing these sorts of cases as a way of making a name and distinguishing themselves in a difficult legal market where they're being excluded. So I wouldn't want to think of global law firms as the sole point of entry into the legal market in the countries where we work.
So in South Africa, perhaps it's an exaggeration to say we depend wholly on what could be the big fund, because in and amongst that, there are a wide range of sole proprietors to small and medium law firms that are South African owned and managed and run. I think one of the factors in how much pro bono support we get from the local law firms versus the big five that have an international footprint is a resource differentiation. And so the bigger law firms, whether we like it or not, have a lot more resources as in human capacity as well as in resources of time to be able to provide a steady stream of young lawyers. And I think this is also important, that the reliance on young lawyers seems to be a pattern in many pro bono sort of efforts. And I think that's coupled with the need for young lawyers to have a steady stream of clients from whom they learn and share preliminary legal knowledge, etc. What's also important to consider in all of this is that the kinds of matters and the appetite that certain law firms have in taking on different legal issues also varies. So as an example, in South Africa, we see a steady reliance on maybe issues of 5 key legal needs. And that would be your classical employment staff, a little bit of property matters, intestacy matters, and child, family, etc. We have laws that are very progressive in South Africa, as an example, on abortion. And we have a health protocol that suggests if you're in need of an abortion subject to the law, you can have the service delivered from a public health care facility. Hundreds and hundreds of women get turned away and have had to resort to, alternative forms of termination. Lawyers are very reluctant to engage on issues of sexual and reproductive health rights. And I suspect that it's also an issue of learning. And so pushing lawyers or pro bono lawyers into areas of law that they are less comfortable with is part of a challenge that we face. And I think it's about breaking the pattern of relying on a steady stream of repetitive legal needs that you can do in your sleep, basically. Because the civil legal spectrum is so wide. And I think the bigger law firms tend to have a bigger appetite, to really test these things. Whereas some of the more local law firms are really looking at bread and butter issues. And so the resource contributions in time and effort much lower. So whether we like it or not, we do tend to rely quite heavily on some of the law firms that have a global footprint based in Johannesburg.
So Stanley, what I'm hearing from this is there is a role for maybe regional organisations, maybe NGOs to create partnerships. And in a sense, that was part of these sessions, to think about sustainable development goals, how they can be brought into thinking about pro bono. And I think a place where there's real opportunities, partnerships between global firms and local firms, where we can develop synergies in who has the resources, who has the expertise, which type of matters that maybe the global firms are less inclined to take on, and then maybe issues it up. So what could be the role of regional organisations in fomenting those partnerships?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very important to realize that the simple answer is yes, we need the global law firms to come in, because the more the merrier, of course. But as an issue of architecture or governance of the region, you will discover that the global law firms actually come with a concept that brings an answer, a very practical answer to what is a key challenge to development of the region. Inside, for example, is the issue of regional integration. We've got all these instruments, we've got all this need to move services and people across borders, and there's just stiff resistance from governments, there's stiff resistance from even within the legal profession for reciprocal recognition of services. Now, in the meantime, I've already argued to my colleagues that global law firms don't recognize these borders. They work across the borders. Every So we really need to learn from the models within which we can learn to break down these borders and the tools and become more effective across just the region, but potentially across the globe as well, if we take leadership in emulating these models. So I'm very, very much thinking that the concept of global norms at a regional level can change the architecture of governance and the developmental trajectory of our region.
So in a sense, pro bono can maybe be the Trojan horse for sort of regional integration in the region. It's like, let's all work across borders on matters with pro bono, and then actually that can sort of bring a harmonization. That's really fascinating. I'm aware of time, so what we're going to do, we could keep talking. We could keep talking for hours, but I want to open this up. And, well, it looks like we've already got some questions already. We have the roving mic, otherwise I could pass this.
Stanley, I was just wondering whether any plans to extend the network to engage the law schools in Southern Africa. Because you talk about culture change, it's very important to go upstream, especially law schools with the formative years. Exposing them to pro bono work gets them very excited, very idealistic. That's a very powerful way of making sure that when they go into practice, it's something that we'll keep on doing as well too. So I would recommend considering that, because that's a very, very good way of engaging the next generation of lawyers for what the network is actually trying to do.
Oh yes, thank you very much. And we do actually acknowledge that catching them young is the best way to teach them the culture of pro bono. So while the older ones may be older dogs that are hard to teach new tricks, but the more we focus on the young ones, the better we are going to be able to create that critical mass of young leaders who think differently. And we're not only thinking about talking to them about pro bono, but about ethics and about integrity and staying away from things like corruption, so that we create a whole new generation of leaders who are going to take our continent in a different direction.
One really interesting initiative that's, I think, starting to take off in a lot of parts of the African continent is clinical legal education as a way to give people practical experience in pro bono and public interest lawyering. South Africa is definitely a leader. Nigeria is a leader in West Africa. It is slowly moving across into some of the Francophone countries, but it's been harder just because it's a very different type of a legal education system. But we've seen, for example, in Sierra Leone, there's only 2 law schools in the country. One of them has started a clinic that is mandatory for all students. They have to do it for all 3 of the years that they're there. So in a country where there's only a couple of hundred lawyers total, you're very rapidly creating a new generation of lawyers, all of them who have that exposure. We're trying to do something similar in Cote d'Ivoire, but there are a lot of barriers, as I said, because of the differences between Francophone and legal education.
Garth, I think you had a question. Oh, yes.
No, you.
Oh, okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I just wonder about the views that people have on this, the community-based justice systems that exist in many of these countries that have so few resources. I mean, South African community advice officers, but I think they're all over Africa, are obviously a potential area where the pro bono lawyer can play quite an important role. Through education, empowerment, collaboration on cases. I'm interested in just what the view of the panelists is on this as a potential area of pro bono work, and also the way that it can be used to really enhance access to justice in an environment where there's such an incredible shortage of formal legal assistance. And in a sense, also how it can redefine what we consider to be law, to a sort of sense of legal empowerment through community legal structures, and then the role that the narrower legal profession can play in relation to that.
Can I just build my question onto that? It's very, very brief. In one of yesterday's discussions, one of the distinctions we talked about was sort of between cases and clients. And I think this often characterizes pro bono, that often we sort of react to clients who come in, react to cases when sort of clients come to us with problems. But in the private sector, the firms tend to have clients, and they give them advice about a whole range of matters. And so what I think these community centers in part do is they help us to treat society more in the sense of being clients who have a range of legal needs, and they tend to empower them to be better able to shape outcomes. So I think it's a very interesting way of trying to combine what pro bono can do and get us beyond sort of the case-by-case attempt to solve problems.
So it sounds like I'm trying to sort of synthesize. So we're talking about sort of community justice, we're talking about case compliance. What I'm hearing is how we can be more strategic, how we can understand really what the needs are, how we can be more consultative with affected communities, and how we can have greater community engagement, and how we can do that through pro bono.
So, thanks, Erica. Erica is the former pro bono director. I think in South Africa, we cannot deny the huge and important role that community-based paralegals have played. From pre-1994, and we see that there's an upsurge in paralegal services at a community level. So for us, it's an absolute no-brainer that one important source of intake and service to community has to be through a more strategic matching of pro bono, public-spirited lawyers together with some community advice office, paralegal-based formation. How we do that is slightly more complicated because the spread of rural land in South Africa is vast. So we have a concentration of law firms in many parts of the urban environment, and largely in some of the big metropoles of the country. To get attorneys and advocates and legal practitioners into a community environment is going to require a stretch of imagination, because it does dispel the notion of comfort in the way you deliver a service. And so the community advice office sector, terribly under-resourced, you know, from infrastructure right through to actual capacity. But I do think that there are models emerging for how a matching can happen in a locus, in a jurisdiction where we find young lawyers without employment, but who are as capable, you know, as any other lawyer in providing some frontline support to community advice officers. So we're exploring a number of possibilities because we cannot ignore the needs at that level, and if we are to go, you know, in line with our sort of ambition to expand access to justice, then we have to move beyond, you know, a sort of confined infrastructural ring fence of urban and, you know, big office kind of domain.
It sounds like, Marlene, for your work as well, there's a real important nexus with community. And this is where the issues arise. This is where, you know, reproductive health and reproductive rights is really at its core. So how do we create these partnerships in the communities to actually, and with pro bono, to get these rights realised?
I think you're totally right. I mean, as I said, our work is all done in partnership. And even the individual matters and cases we take on in Kenya were brought to us by partners or other groups. So we really are part of a wide network throughout East Africa. I'd say NGOs that focus on women's issues and health. And we tried also at the center in a way to, and as an example, I mean, think about this, of expanding access to pro bono that we can sometimes give that a small NGO might have. And it's a little bit off, maybe totally in terms of access to justice. I used to work at the Legal Aid Society, so I understand this totally. And I hate to tell you, in the United States, it's the same thing. If you're in a city, you get a lawyer. If you're in a rural community, you can't. But I was going to say that when the U.S. government under Trump reenacted what we call the Global Gag Rule, which is taking away U.S. aid to family planning NGOs, and actually he expanded it so it affected any health-related HIV/AIDS any type of health-related work, Zika virus, and in fact like $9 billion instead of $600 million of funding. We set up what we call the Global Data Dual Pro Bono Clearinghouse. So it's a way to help our partners in these countries, and in Africa is a great example, who are all of a sudden being faced with whether or not they had to sign the data rule or they had to comply. So we were able to kind of link them to pro bono attorneys to give them compliance advice. And, you know, it's twofold. A, we thought it was really important and we really wanted to help them, but it also strengthens our community of NGOs and partnerships in Africa by being able to build their capacity. So.
We are running out of time, so I'm just going to give you on this point, literally 30 seconds for each panelist. What are the roles, particularly at the regional level, involving sort of community levels in your initiative, and the same in West Africa as well? Really short answer, please.
I think the short answer to that is when we continue to look at what we can do to effectively especially pro bono as well societies, purely as legal organizations, operate as private pro bono. The necessary corollary, the flip side of pro bono is paralegal activity. And this has been the way in which community engagement and outreach has been most effective, and some of the most important interventions for environmental human rights abuses have come from paralegal involvement. So we're definitely working on a paralegal support facility that we want to make as an extension to the program.
I think I would just say that paralegals are incredibly important, especially where legal services don't extend out to the countryside, and where there's such a social and cultural divide between the kind of elite echelon of lawyers and people living in rural communities. Paralegals often live in the communities with the people that they're working with very close. They understand the issues very well. But there's a huge range of paralegal programs. And when it's done well, they connect. There's a connection point to the legal system. And I think Michelle, you referenced that. But I've seen a lot that don't. And then I think you run the risk of ghettoizing again rural poor people as being people to whom law doesn't really apply. And instead, you sort of push them. You can be shuttling them aside into this kind of parallel system. So as long as the connection points are well drawn, and we have things like legal education in the law schools, clinical programs, bar associations promoting caravans into the countryside where lawyers set aside their comfort for a moment and start to understand what they're dealing with, then I think paralegal programs can work very well.
So it sounds like, just to round things up, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a definite place, and more of a place for global firms. But what I'm really hearing about is that to develop pro bono on the continent about partnerships that can bridge gaps, that can reach communities, that can provide expertise when there isn't available. And I think that's a really exciting kind of place where we can leave off. But it's not the end of the conversation, because we can continue this conversation over the lunch session, which will be at 12:55. So if anyone wants to continue talking about it, it'll be a much more open roundtable. I'd love to hear your thoughts and how we can progress the idea of pro bono activity. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for our panelists.